In part 2, we're going to talk about multi-step equations that are quadratic and cubic. If we have negative 4x squared plus 42 equals negative 102, you need to use the inverse operations to isolate the variable term first. Your goal is to get x squared by itself first. The last step you should do is square root. So before we do the square root step, we need to get x squared by itself. So to do that, I'm going to subtract 42 from both sides, and that gives me negative 144 equals negative 4x squared. Negative 4 is being multiplied by x squared, so to get x squared by itself, I need to divide both sides by negative 4. I'm left with x squared equals positive 36. Now my last step, now that I have isolated x squared, my last step is to take the square root on both sides. You need to show that step in your work. You need to show that you understand that the inverse of squared is square root, and that is what we're doing to get x by itself. And the square root of 36 is positive or negative 6. Since squaring a number, squaring a positive is positive, squaring a negative is positive, we could use positive or negative 6 in place of x to make this equation true. So this answer represents two possible solutions. Another example, x squared minus 11 equals 25. We're going to isolate x squared by adding 11 to both sides. 36 equals 4 times x squared. Get x squared by itself now by dividing both sides by 4. X squared equals 9. What's the inverse operation of squared? Square root. What I do to one side, I do to the other. When I take the square root of 9, I need to understand that that could be positive or negative 3. Positive or negative 3 would be the two solutions here. Another example. X squared plus 10 equals 50. Let's isolate x squared by subtracting 10 from both sides. X squared equals 40. The next step is to take the square root. What you do to one side, you do to the other. So I'm left with x equals plus or minus square root of 40. The square root of 40 is an irrational number, so if I'm asked to solve and leave my answer as an exact value, this is where I would stop. Of course, if we wanted to estimate that, we would know that this value is a little bit more than positive or negative 6, since the square root of 40 is a little bit more than the square root of 36. But I'm going to stop right here and leave this in exact terms. Cubic equations are very similar. If we have x cubed plus 8 equals negative 117, before we can take the cube root and isolate x, we need to get x cubed by itself. To get x cubed by itself, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So I'm left with x cubed equals negative 125. Now the inverse of cube is cube root. I can take the cube root of a negative number because a negative times a negative times a negative does equal a negative value. Cubed equations always have one solution. The cube root of negative 125 is negative 5. So that is the one value that when substituted into this equation makes a true statement. Another example, if we have 64x cubed equals 8. To get x cubed by itself, which is always my first step, I'm going to divide both sides by 64. I'm left with x cubed equals 8 over 64. I can leave it like that, or I can simplify to x cubed equals 1 over 8. But my next step, no matter what I do, is to take the cube root on both sides. When you're taking the cube root of a fraction, you take the cube root of the numerator and the cube root of the denominator. So here x is equal to positive 2 over 4, which simplifies to 1/2. Or over here, x is equal to the cube root of 1, which is 1, the cube root of 8, which is 2. So either way, we simplified first and then took the cube root and got 1/2, or we took the cube root first and then simplified and got 1/2. One more example. If we have negative 5x squared minus 9 equals 116, add 9 to both sides. Negative 5 times x squared equals positive 125. Now I need to get x squared by itself. Divide by negative 5 on both sides. X squared equals negative 25. I can take the square root on both sides, or I know already that x squared cannot equal a negative number. I cannot take the square root of a negative number. That would not be a real number. So my final answer here is no real number solution. There's no real number that will be substituted to make this a true statement. Remember, x squared equations could have 2 solutions, 1 solution, or no real number solutions. X cubed equations always have 1 solution. Good luck!